Welcome back to Klepper's Corner, Today in History. June 11th is one of those dates where history checks humanity's work and finds notes like, do not accept wooden animals, name a successor, and maybe don't turn a marriage problem into a national religion. Today we get empires, kings, reefs, revolutions, coups, monks, prisoners, aliens, and one loud World Cup. Segment 1 and the Gift Horse Empire. According to the ancient calculations of Eratosthenes, June 11th marks the fall of Troy, the great fortified city that survived 10 years of war and then lost to interior decorating. The Greeks could not smash their way in, so they pretended to leave behind a giant wooden horse as an offering, which the Trojans dragged inside because apparently ancient homeland security was just one exhausted man saying, "Looks festive." Whether the date is exact history or poetic bookkeeping, the story lasts because it understands power perfectly. Troy had walls, warriors, and warnings, but what it lacked was the ability to believe bad news after a good day. That same human flaw appears again with Alexander the Great, who died in Babylon on or near June 11th, 323 BC. After conquering an empire so large, even the succession plan needed a map. He was 32, feverish, possibly poisoned, possibly infected, possibly just living proof that the human body was not designed to administer Asia after a drinking party. When his generals asked who should rule, the reported answer was the strongest, which is less a political system than a gym membership with cavalry. His empire shattered into wars among his commanders, even as Greek culture spread across the lands he had taken. Troy fell because people trusted a hollow symbol. Alexander's empire fell because everyone trusted one man to be the symbol forever. History keeps warning us that greatness without maintenance is just a very expensive accident waiting for a handle. Segment 2 and royal families now with more stabbing. Monarchies sell themselves as stable, sacred, and ordained by heaven, which is charming until you notice how often the heir is waiting nearby with an army. On June 11th, 1488, King James III of Scotland faced rebellion at Sauchiehburn, with the opposition nominally led by his own 15-year-old son. James had angered nobles by favoring unpopular advisors and chasing alliances they hated, which in medieval politics is like changing the lock on a castle and forgetting everyone owns axes. After the battle turned against him, the injured king fled to Beaton's Mill and called for a priest. An enemy came disguised as one and stabbed him to death, giving Scotland perhaps the darkest version of "your appointment has been moved up." His son became King James IV and spent his life wearing a heavy iron chain belt as penance, because guilt used to come with hardware. Then, on June 11, 1509, King Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon in what looked like a clever Catholic alliance with Spain. At first, it looked practical, even romantic by Tudor standards. But after years without a surviving male heir, Henry suddenly developed a theological objection to the marriage he had defended. When the Pope would not annul it, Henry broke with Rome and made himself head of the Church of England. A bold customer service strategy. If the manager says no, create a new manager and crown yourself. One king is murdered by a fake priest. Another turns priestly authority into an HR problem. Family values, history reminds us, often arrive holding a knife and a legal brief. Segment 3 and founding nations with leaky boats. On June 11, 1770, Captain James Cook's HMS Endeavour struck the Great Barrier Reef in the dark while charting Australia's eastern coast, because exploration was basically science wearing a blindfold over open water. The ship ground onto coral near 11 at night, and the crew spent frantic hours throwing overboard ballast, water casks, cannons, and probably whatever confidence the British Empire had left on deck. To stop the leak, they used fothering, lowering a sail packed with oakum, wool, stones, and sheep dung over the damaged hull so water pressure would pull the mess into the hole. The Enlightenment gave us reason, classification, and the emergency discovery that wet sheep dung can save a scientific expedition. A chunk of coral also wedged into the breach, turning the reef from attempted murderer into reluctant plumber. The forced repair stop preserved Joseph Banks's specimens and created extended contact with indigenous Australians, while also putting the Great Barrier Reef onto European maps in the most British way possible, by hitting it. 6 years later, on June 11, 1776, the Continental Congress appointed the Committee of Five to draft the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson wrote the main draft, with Benjamin Franklin and John Adams editing, because even revolution needs someone to say, "Great passion, Tom, maybe make the tyranny pop." The committee turned rebellion into language about rights, consent, and legitimacy. Cook's crew patched a wooden hull. The founders patched a political argument, though with a moral leak called slavery, they avoided inspecting. Nations often begin this way. Someone survives the crash, someone writes the manifesto, and everyone agrees to call the mess destiny. Modern power learned a cruel lesson on June 11th. It can survive rumors, but not always images. In 1903, Serbia's King Alexander I and Queen Draga were murdered during the May overthrow, a palace coup that sounds like Shakespeare rewritten by a demolition crew. Alexander had suspended constitutional norms, alienated the military, and married Draga, whose unpopularity had become a national hobby. Officers led by Dragutin Dmitrijevic, known as Apis, entered the palace after midnight, cut the lights, blasted doors with dynamite, and found the royal couple hiding behind a mirror. That detail is almost too perfect. A monarchy looking at itself while the future breaks in with explosives. The assassins killed them, ended the Obrenovic dynasty, and helped shift Serbia away from Austria-Hungary and toward Russia and France. 11 years later, Balkan tension would help ignite World War I, with Apis again circling the disaster like history's worst recurring guest star. Then, on June 11, 1963, Buddhist monk Thich Quang Duc sat calmly in a Saigon street and set himself on fire to protest President Ngo Dinh Diem's persecution of Buddhists. Malcolm Brown's photograph moved around the world and made denial impossible. Quang Duc did not scream or move, a stillness so disciplined and exposed the regime's panic more than any speech could. Madame New then mocked the death as a barbecue, the kind of public comment that does not merely lose sympathy, it files the regime's resignation in advance. A palace corpse and a burning monk are radically different images, but both announce the same fact. Legitimacy had left the building, and propaganda was outside with the wrong key. June 11th also belongs to escape artists, some with spoons, some with spaceships, and some with stadium horns. In 1962, Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin slipped out of Alcatraz, the prison America advertised as inescapable, which is risky because inescapable sounds less like security and more like a challenge issued to bored men with utensils. They widened vents with stolen spoons and homemade tools, hid the work with cardboard, left plastered dummy heads in their beds, climbed through utility corridors, and launched a raft made from stolen raincoats into San Francisco Bay. The official view was that they likely drowned, but later title studies suggested survival was possible if they left at the right moment. Either way, the myth cracked. The fortress was not beaten by an army, but by patience, decay, and men who saw concrete as a long-term spoon project. On June 11, 1982, E.T., the extraterrestrial, premiered and offered a gentler escape story. A stranded alien trying to get home with help from a lonely child. Steven Spielberg turned science fiction away from invasion panic and toward empathy, proving a blockbuster could run on divorce, wonder, and a wrinkly botanist with excellent candy placement. Then, in 2010, the World Cup opened in South Africa, the first hosted on African soil, turning a nation once isolated by apartheid into the center of the sporting world. The vuvuzelas were loud, relentless, and culturally unmistakable, which was the point. Alcatraz, E.T., and that World Cup all ask who gets trapped, who gets home, and who gets seen on their own terms. Sometimes escape is a raft in the dark. Sometimes it is a bicycle crossing the moon. Sometimes it is a continent saying, you brought the cameras, but we brought the soundtrack. In conclusion, June 11th gives us a wooden horse, a dead conqueror, a murdered king, a marriage that broke a church, a reef-struck ship, a drafted revolution, a palace coup, a monk whose protests burned through propaganda, a prison break, a stranded alien, and a World Cup that changed the sound of the planet. The pattern is not subtle. People build walls, crowns, prisons, empires, and official stories. Then history sends in desire, ego, faith, fear, paperwork, or one determined man with a spoon. And suddenly, the permanent thing needs repairs.